I accepted a pay cut to help the company, but when it recovered, my director fired me coldly. "You're no longer needed." "All right, good luck," I replied. But when the judge defined the value of my rights, he had to accept my proposal to return as majority partner. I never thought I'd hear those words coming from someone I had trusted so deeply. "You're no longer needed, Rebecca." Richard Crawford's voice echoed through the office I had helped build, cold as the winter wind hitting the 30th floor window. 15 years of my life, incalculable sacrifices, sleepless nights, lost weekends, all summarized in one cruel and definitive sentence. I could have screamed, could have cried, could have begged. Instead, I took a deep breath, looked into the eyes of this man I had considered a mentor, and simply said, "All right, good luck." He blinked, clearly expecting a different reaction. But I had already learned that the best revenge is served cold, and mine was just beginning to chill. Subscribe now to discover the shocking end of this story that will make you question everything you know about corporate loyalty and justice. You won't believe how this brilliant woman turned her worst betrayal into the ultimate victory that left her former boss begging for mercy. Click subscribe and find out how she went from victim to victor in the most satisfying way possible. It all started 15 years ago when Richard Crawford hired me as operations manager at Crawford & Associates, a business consulting firm he had founded 3 years earlier. I was 28, fresh out of Harvard with an MBA, and determined to prove my worth in the corporate world. Richard, then 42, was charismatic, visionary, and apparently committed to excellence. In the early years, our professional partnership worked like a Swiss watch. I handled operations, he focused on business development. The company grew exponentially. From 5 employees, we expanded to 50. From a small downtown office, we moved to an entire floor in one of the city's most prestigious buildings. Richard frequently called me his right hand, saying I was indispensable to the company's success. During this period, I developed internal systems that revolutionized our operational efficiency. I created customer service protocols that became industry benchmarks. I established strategic partnerships that increased our revenue by 300%. I wasn't just an employee, I was an architect of Crawford & Associates' success. The trust between us seemed unshakable. Richard gave me power of attorney to sign contracts on his behalf. I had access to all company bank accounts. I participated in all important strategic decisions. On several occasions, he casually mentioned that I would be his natural successor when he decided to retire. My role went far beyond what any traditional operations manager would handle. I negotiated major contracts, made hiring and firing decisions, developed proprietary methodologies that became our core service offerings, and essentially ran the day-to-day operations, while Richard focused on high-level networking and business development. I had created what I called the Crawford Method, a comprehensive approach to organizational restructuring that became our signature service. This methodology wasn't just another consulting framework, it was a revolutionary approach that combined psychological insights with operational efficiency. I spent 2 years developing it, conducting research, testing it with pilot clients, and refining every aspect until it became bulletproof. The Crawford Method involved a 7-phase process that addressed not just structural changes, but also cultural transformation within organizations. Phase styles 1 focused on diagnostic assessment, where I would spend weeks embedded within client companies, observing workflows, interviewing employees at every level, and identifying both obvious and hidden inefficiencies. Most consultants rushed through this phase, but I understood that accurate diagnosis was the foundation of successful transformation. Phase 2 involved stakeholder mapping and resistance analysis. I had learned early in my career that the biggest obstacle to organizational change wasn't technical limitations, but human psychology. People resist change, even when it benefits them. So I developed techniques to identify key influencers, understand their motivations, and create change strategies that turn potential opponents into advocates. The remaining phases covered strategic planning, implementation roadmaps, communication protocols, training programs, and long-term sustainability measures. What made the Crawford method unique was its emphasis on measurable outcomes and the continuous adaptation. Unlike other consulting approaches that delivered recommendations and disappeared, our method included quarterly reviews and adjustments for the first 2 years of implementation. Clients specifically requested me by name, not just because of the methodology, but because of how I personally managed each engagement. I wasn't the kind of consultant who delegated client relationships to junior staff. I was hands-on with every major account, building relationships that went beyond professional transactions. These clients trusted me with their most sensitive business challenges because I had proven time and again that I could deliver results. One of our most successful cases involved restructuring Meridian Manufacturing, a family-owned business that was struggling with succession planning and operational inefficiencies. When they first approached us, their revenue had declined 30% over 3 years. Family members were fighting over strategic direction, and employee morale was at an all-time low. I spent 6 weeks at their facility, working alongside employees, attending family meetings, and gradually gaining the trust of all stakeholders. The breakthrough came when I identified that their core problem wasn't operational but emotional. The founding father was struggling to let go of control, while his children felt unprepared and undervalued. The Crawford method helped us develop a 2-year transition plan that addressed both technical and emotional aspects of succession. We restructured their operations, implemented new technology systems, created clear role definitions for family members, and established governance structures that balanced family dynamics with business needs. The results were extraordinary. Within 18 months, Meridian's revenue increased 45%, employee satisfaction scores improved dramatically, and the family relationships were stronger than they had been in years. More importantly, the company had sustainable systems in place for continued growth. This success story became one of our signature case studies, and word-of-mouth referrals from Meridian alone generated over $800,000 in new business for Crawford and Associates. I had built personal relationships with key accounts that generated millions in recurring revenue. Companies like Meridian didn't just hire us for projects. They retained us as ongoing strategic advisors. In many ways, I was as much the face of the company as Richard was. At industry conferences, people approached me to discuss potential engagements. Trade publications featured articles about the Crawford method with my byline. Professional associations invited me to speak at their events. Richard was certainly the founder and official leader, but I had become the intellectual and operational heart of the business. But everything began to change in 2019 when the company faced its first major crisis. One of our biggest clients, responsible for 40% of our revenue, decided to cancel their contract due to internal budget cuts. Almost simultaneously, 2 other important clients also terminated their agreements, citing corporate restructuring. Within 3 months, our revenue plummeted by 65%. Richard panicked. Emergency meetings became a daily routine. The office atmosphere grew tense, and some employees began looking for other opportunities, sensing the impending shipwreck. It was during this moment that I demonstrated my loyalty in a way I never thought possible. In a particularly difficult meeting when Richard admitted he might need to close the company, I raised my hand and made a proposal that would change everything. What if we temporarily reduce senior management's salaries to keep the team and give us time to recover our clients? Richard looked at me as if I had offered a miracle. "You would do that, Rebecca?" he asked, his eyes welling up. "Of course," I replied without hesitation. "This company is our home. Let's protect it." That same week, I reduced my operations director salary from $180,000 annually to $60,000. Richard made a symbolic reduction of $30,000 from his president's salary, still maintaining a substantially higher compensation than mine. Other managers also accepted cuts, but none as drastic as mine. For the following 18 months, I worked harder than I had ever worked before. I arrived at the office at 6 a.m. and left after midnight. Weekends became extensions of workdays. I developed new products, restructured internal processes, negotiated with suppliers, courted potential clients with almost obsessive dedication. During this period, I also took on additional responsibilities that should have commanded significant additional compensation. I personally managed our largest remaining client relationship with Meridian Manufacturing, traveling to their facility twice monthly to oversee the implementation of our restructuring plan. These trips often required me to work 16-hour days, conducting workshops, facilitating difficult conversations between family members, and troubleshooting operational challenges in real time. I also became our primary liaison with potential new clients during the crisis. While Richard focused on internal cost-cutting and damage control, I was the one meeting with prospects, presenting proposals, and negotiating contracts. Sales wasn't traditionally part of my operations role, but desperate times called for expanded responsibilities. Additionally, I covered some of Richard's traditional CEO functions when he became overwhelmed by the crisis. I represented the company at industry events, participated in strategic planning sessions with our board of advisors, and even handled media interviews when trade publications wanted to understand how we were navigating the economic downturn. The most challenging additional responsibility was managing our employee communications during the crisis. While Richard retreated into his office, clearly stressed and sometimes short-tempered with staff, I became the emotional anchor for our team. I held weekly all-hands meetings to provide updates on our recovery efforts, conducted one-on-one sessions with employees who were worried about job security, and worked with HR to maintain morale despite the uncertainty. I also took over our vendor relationships during this period. Our accounts payable had become strained due to cash flow issues, and several key suppliers were threatening to suspend services. I personally negotiated extended payment terms with our office leaseholder, our IT service provider, our insurance company, and our cleaning service. These negotiations required me to essentially guarantee payments with my personal credibility, putting my own professional reputation on the line to keep the company operational. Perhaps most significantly, I temporarily assumed responsibility for our financial management when Richard's stress levels made him unreliable in this area. I worked directly with our accountant to develop cash flow projections, monitor our bank accounts daily, and make decisions about which expenses were essential and which could be deferred. All of these additional responsibilities required skills and time far beyond my original job description, yet I was performing them at a drastically reduced salary. I was essentially running the company while Richard struggled to cope with the crisis, but my compensation suggested I was merely an operations manager with reduced duties. Slowly, the tide began to turn. We secured 3 important new contracts. An old client decided to resume our partnership. My new operational systems began generating significant savings, increasing our profit margin even with lower revenue. By the end of 2020, Crawford & Associates had not only survived the crisis, but was stronger than before. Our operational efficiency had improved dramatically. Our market reputation was solid. The employees, motivated by how we managed the crisis, were more committed than ever. That's when I began to notice subtle changes in Richard's behavior. He started consulting me less about important decisions. He began holding client meetings without including me. When I asked about these changes, he said he was trying to better divide responsibilities and give me more time to focus on operations. Naively, I interpreted this as consideration. I thought he was recognizing my exhaustion after months of intense work. I never imagined I was being systematically excluded from the strategic decisions I had helped create. What I didn't realize was that Richard was already planning his exit strategy, not from the company, but from our partnership. He had started viewing my sacrifices not as investments in our shared success, but as proof that he could extract maximum value from me with minimal compensation. The first clue that something was fundamentally wrong came in January 2021. I was organizing documents for our annual audit when I found a contract I didn't recognize. It was a consulting agreement with Brennan Industries, a mid-sized automotive sector company. The value was substantial, $280,000 for 8 months of work. The strange thing was that I knew nothing about this client. During 15 years, I had participated in all major negotiations. I personally knew all our key clients, but Brennan Industries was completely new to me. When I questioned Richard about the contract, he seemed momentarily uncomfortable before responding. "Oh, that. It was an opportunity that came through personal contacts. I thought not to burden you with another project, considering your current workload." The explanation seemed reasonable, but something in his tone bothered me. I decided to investigate discreetly. A simple LinkedIn search revealed that Brennan Industries' CEO, Marcus Brennan, had worked at the same company as Richard in the 1990s before founding Crawford & Associates. They were former colleagues, possibly friends. This alone wasn't suspicious. Business through personal networking was common in our field. But when I analyzed our financial records more carefully, I discovered this wasn't an isolated case. In the past 6 months, Richard had closed at least 4 significant contracts without my participation or knowledge. The revenue from these personal contracts totaled almost $800,000, an amount representing approximately 45% of our annual revenue, and I knew nothing about them. What made this discovery even more troubling was the pattern I began to notice in these hidden contracts. They all shared certain characteristics that suggested systematic deception rather than innocent oversight. First, they were all structured as shorter-term engagements, typically 3 to 6 months, which kept them under our internal reporting thresholds for projects that required board approval. Second, they all involved clients from Richard's personal network rather than leads generated through our normal marketing and sales processes. Third, and most damaging, several of these contracts involved services that directly utilized methodologies I had developed. The Brennan Industries contract, for example, specifically mentioned implementation of proprietary organizational assessment tools and custom restructuring frameworks. These were clear references to components of the Crawford method that I had created and that formed the intellectual foundation of our most successful client engagements. Richard was essentially selling my innovations without my knowledge, receiving full credit and compensation for work that was fundamentally mine. It was intellectual theft disguised as business development. I spent the next several weeks discreetly investigating each of these hidden contracts. I couldn't access the full documentation without raising suspicions, but I was able to piece together enough information to understand the scope of what Richard was doing. The Hamilton Group contract involved a 6-month engagement to optimize operational workflows and implement efficiency protocols. This was clearly the Crawford method, probably phases 1 through 4 of our 7-phase process. The fee was $340,000, which was consistent with our standard pricing for that level of engagement. Morrison Industries had hired us for leadership transition consulting and cultural transformation. Again, this was unmistakably our methodology, specifically the stakeholder mapping and change management components that I had spent months developing. The fee was $290,000. Blackstone Consulting had retained us for diagnostic assessment and strategic restructuring recommendations. This was essentially phases 1 and 2 of the Crawford method, packaged as a standalone engagement. The fee was $180,000. Each of these contracts represented work that should have involved me directly, both because they used my intellectual property and because client engagements of this size typically required my personal involvement to ensure quality and client satisfaction. But what disturbed me most was the realization that Richard had likely been positioning these engagements in a way that minimized my involvement from the beginning. He was probably telling these clients that he would personally handle their projects, leveraging his relationship with them to exclude me from what should have been collaborative efforts. This wasn't just about money. Although the financial implications were staggering, Richard had essentially created a parallel consulting practice using my innovations, my methodologies, and the reputation we had built together, but structured in a way that excluded me from both the work and the profits. I began systematically documenting these discoveries. I copied contracts, saved emails, recorded dates and values. Something told me this information would be important in the future, although I didn't yet know exactly why. The second clue came a few weeks later during a casual conversation with Jennifer, our administrative coordinator. She mentioned that Richard had asked her to prepare monthly financial reports that included only the contracts I managed directly. He said he was creating a new metric system to evaluate different areas of the company, Jennifer explained. Not realizing the implication of her words, my stomach contracted. Why would Richard need reports that specifically excluded the contracts he personally managed? Why artificially separate our performance when we had always worked as an integrated team? That night I stayed at the office late and accessed our financial system to analyze the data more comprehensively. What I discovered left me speechless. Over the past 8 months, while I worked with reduced salary to save the company, Richard had secretly developed a parallel client portfolio, generating substantial revenue. Crawford and Associates wasn't just recovered, it was thriving more than ever. But this prosperity was being deliberately hidden from me. The reports I received showed only modest recovery, justifying maintaining my reduced salary. Meanwhile, Richard was profiting significantly from work I didn't know existed. That night I made a decision that would change everything. I began implementing my own documentation strategy. I installed a discrete recording app on my phone. I started backing up all your important emails to personal accounts. I photographed relevant documents and stored them in a secure cloud drive. More importantly, I began researching my labor rights. I discovered that my situation was much more complex than I had imagined. During 15 years, I had performed functions that went far beyond those specified in my original contract. I had signed contracts on behalf of the company, made fundamental strategic decisions, developed intellectual property that became core business for the organization. I discreetly consulted with a labor attorney, David Martinez, who had an excellent reputation in complex cases involving senior executives. After analyzing my situation, he was direct. Rebecca, based on what you've described, you have grounds not just for wrongful termination, but for substantial compensation, including unpaid overtime, benefits, and potentially punitive damages. I explained about the voluntary salary reduction during the crisis, unpaid overtime hours, management responsibilities assumed without adequate compensation. David took detailed notes and then looked at me seriously. If you're fired or your functions are arbitrarily reduced, we have basis for a very strong case. The amount of unpaid compensation, especially considering your reduced salary during the crisis and the additional responsibilities you took on, could be substantial. Over the following months, I continued working normally while meticulously building my case. I documented every overtime hour, every strategic decision I participated in, every innovative contribution I developed. I recorded conversations where Richard acknowledged my fundamental importance to the company. The most revealing was a recording from December 2021, during our year-end party. Richard, after a few drinks, made an emotional speech about how the company had overcome the crisis. In a moment of alcoholic honesty, he said, "None of this would be possible without Rebecca. She literally saved our company. She's my true partner, my co-founder in everything except on paper." This recording would become one of the key pieces of my case. Meanwhile, I began to notice that Richard was taking steps to gradually distance me from core operations. He hired an external strategic consultant, Marcus Webb, who began assuming some of my historical responsibilities. He created a new business development director position and internally promoted someone to this role, transferring some of my client relationship duties to this person. When I questioned these changes, Richard always had plausible explanations. "I'm trying to professionalize our structure more," or "You deserve to focus on areas where you're most brilliant without overloading yourself with other responsibilities." But I understood the game. He was systematically documenting that my functions were being reduced, creating justification for future dismissal or demotion. It was a sophisticated and well-executed strategy. In March 2022, I felt the noose tightening. Richard had significantly reduced my access to strategic financial information. I was no longer included in meetings with the most important clients. My direct team had been reorganized and now reported directly to him. That's when I decided to accelerate my preparation. I scheduled additional meetings with David Martinez and also hired a consultancy specializing in business valuation and employment compensation analysis. I needed precise numbers about the real value of my contributions and what I was owed. The analysis was revealing. Over 15 years factoring in unpaid overtime, I regularly worked 60-70-hour weeks, additional responsibilities beyond my job description, the salary reduction during the crisis, and the value I had created through my innovations and client relationships. The total compensation owed to me was estimated between $2.8 million and $3.4 million. The breakdown was staggering when presented in detail. For unpaid overtime alone, calculating my regular 60-70-hour work weeks against the standard 40-hour benchmark, I was owed approximately $890,000 over 15 years. This calculation used my average salary during that period and applied standard overtime rates for executive-level positions. The salary reduction during the crisis represented another $216,000 in lost compensation. While Richard had characterized this as a temporary measure, it had lasted 18 months, and my salary had never been restored to its previous level, even after the company's full recovery. But the largest component was the undercompensation for my actual responsibilities versus my official title. A comprehensive market analysis revealed that someone performing my actual duties, operational leadership, business development, intellectual property creation, crisis management, and executive decision-making, should have been earning between $280,000 and $320,000 annually. My average compensation over 15 years had been approximately $165,000. This gap represented roughly $1.8 million in undercompensation over the course of my tenure. Additionally, there was the question of intellectual property rights. The Crawford method, which had become our signature service offering and generated millions in revenue, was legally my creation. While it bore the company name, I had developed it entirely on my own time initially, before proposing it as a company service. Under intellectual property law, I could have a legitimate claim to ongoing royalties from its use. The compensation expert David had hired estimated that my intellectual property contributions alone could be valued at $800,000 to $1.2 million, considering the revenue they had generated and their ongoing value to the company. Finally, there were the punitive damages. Under employment law, when an employer systematically undercompensates an employee and then terminates them to avoid paying proper compensation, courts often award punitive damages as a deterrent. Given the evidence of Richard's deceptive practices and deliberate exclusion of me from profitable work, punitive damages could range from $500,000 to $1 million. When David presented these numbers to me, I was initially skeptical. Could the amount really be that high? But as he walked through each calculation showing me comparable cases and legal precedents, I began to understand that my situation was far more valuable than I had realized. The key, David explained, is that you weren't just an employee who was wrongfully terminated. You were essentially a business partner who was systematically cheated out of your fair share of the company's success, then discarded when it became inconvenient to continue the charade. David Martinez was clear. If he tries to fire you arbitrarily, you won't just receive standard severance. Given the documentation we have, the unpaid compensation, and the circumstances of your salary reduction, we're looking at a very substantial settlement. The final blow came on a Friday in April, exactly as I had predicted. Richard called me for a meeting in his office at the end of the day. His tone was formal, almost ceremonious. I knew what was coming. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you about some changes in the company structure," he began, avoiding my gaze. "We've been rethinking our operational strategy and have concluded that your current position no longer aligns with our future direction." I kept my face neutral, although my heart was racing. 15 years of dedication were being discarded with euphemisms and corporate jargon. Effective immediately, we'll be terminating your employment. Of course, we'll provide the standard severance package as outlined in your contract. The standard severance package, 2 weeks' salary for each year of service, approximately $60,000 based on my reduced salary. After 15 years of building this company, after sacrificing my financial well-being to save it during the crisis, he was offering me pocket change. I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I smiled. Not a bitter smile, but something almost serene. "All right, good luck," I said simply, standing up and extending my hand. Richard seemed genuinely surprised by my calm reaction. He probably expected tears, anger, or desperate negotiation. Instead, I shook his hand firmly and walked out of his office with my head held high. What Richard didn't know was that my phone had been recording the entire conversation. His own words would become crucial evidence in the legal battle to come. The following Monday, I walked into David Martinez's office with 15 years' worth of documentation, contracts I had signed, systems I had developed, clients I had personally secured, overtime hours meticulously tracked, emails acknowledging my contributions, and recordings of conversations, including Richard's own admission that I had saved the company. David reviewed the materials and whistled low. "Rebecca, this is even stronger than we initially thought. The salary reduction during the crisis, combined with your increased responsibilities and the company's subsequent recovery, creates a compelling case for substantial unpaid compensation." We filed the lawsuit 3 weeks later. The complaint detailed not just wrongful termination, but years of unpaid overtime, compensation below market rate for my actual responsibilities, and breach of implied contract based on Richard's repeated promises of partnership and succession. The discovery phase was devastating for Richard. We subpoenaed all company financial records, revealing the hidden client contracts and the true extent of the company's recovery. We deposed several employees who testified about my actual role versus my official title. We presented evidence of my intellectual property contributions that had become core company assets. Most damaging was Richard's own deposition. Under oath, he was forced to admit that I had been essential to the company's survival and growth. He acknowledged that my salary reduction had been crucial to weathering the crisis. He confirmed that I had performed duties far beyond my job description. When pressed about why someone so essential had been terminated, his answers became increasingly contradictory and defensive. The case moved through the courts for 8 months. Richard's lawyers initially offered settlements of $150,000, then $300,000, then $500,000. Each time, David advised me to wait. "They're scared," he told me, "really scared. Let's see how scared they get." The discovery phase was particularly brutal for Richard. His lawyers had clearly advised him that this would be a routine, wrongful termination case that could be settled quickly and quietly. They were completely unprepared for the depth of documentation I had accumulated and the complexity of the legal issues involved. When we subpoenaed Richard's personal communications, we discovered a pattern of emails with his lawyer dating back 6 months before my termination. These emails revealed that Richard had been planning to fire me for much longer than he had admitted, and more damaging, they showed that he was aware of the potential legal exposure his actions created. In one particularly incriminating email, Richard wrote to his lawyer, "I know Rebecca has grounds for a substantial claim if we terminate her, but I can't continue to have her involved in the strategic direction of the company. She knows too much about the business and has too much influence with clients. I need to find a way to minimize the legal exposure while getting her out." His lawyer had responded with advice about documenting performance issues and gradually reducing my responsibilities to create justification for termination. This email chain provided clear evidence that my firing was premeditated and that Richard was aware he was potentially violating my employment rights. But the most damaging discovery came when we found Richard's personal financial records. Through court-ordered disclosure, we learned that Richard had been transferring funds from the company to personal accounts in ways that suggested he was preparing for potential litigation. He had moved approximately $400,000 from company reserves to personal investments, essentially trying to make assets judgment-proof. This discovery allowed David to argue that Richard was acting in bad faith and attempting to defraud potential creditors, which strengthened our case for punitive damages significantly. The depositions were equally revealing. When Richard was questioned under oath about the hidden contracts, his explanations became increasingly contradictory. First, he claimed that I wasn't involved in these projects because they were smaller engagements that didn't require my level of expertise. When presented with evidence that these contracts totaled $800,000 and involved my methodologies, he changed his story to say that he was trying to develop his own consulting skills and didn't want to burden me with additional work. When pressed about why he hadn't disclosed these substantial contracts to me, especially during our financial crisis, when such revenue would have been crucial information, Richard became defensive and evasive. His testimony made it clear that he had deliberately hidden profitable work from me while I was sacrificing my salary to save the company. The deposition of Jennifer, our administrative coordinator, was equally damaging. She testified that Richard had specifically instructed her to prepare financial reports that excluded his personal contracts and that he had told her these reports were for Rebecca's review. This created clear evidence that Richard was deliberately misrepresenting the company's financial status to me. Several former employees also provided depositions that supported my case. They testified about my actual role in the company, the responsibilities I had assumed during the crisis, and the additional work I had taken on without compensation. Their testimony painted a picture of someone who was essentially running the company while being compensated as a mid-level manager. Perhaps most powerful was the testimony of Marcus Brennan, the CEO of Brennan Industries. When questioned about his engagement with Crawford and Associates, he revealed that Richard had specifically told him that I was no longer involved in client work and that he would personally handle their project. This directly contradicted Richard's claim that he was trying to protect me from additional workload. Brennan also testified that the work Richard performed for his company was clearly based on methodologies that had been developed by me, based on our previous interactions at industry events. Richard was essentially delivering Rebecca's approach, Brennan said, but taking full credit for it. The breakthrough came when our business valuation expert testified about my contributions to the company's value. She estimated that my innovations, client relationships, and operational improvements had directly contributed approximately $4.2 million to the company's current value. More importantly, she calculated that my unpaid compensation over 15 years, including overtime, salary below market rate for my actual responsibilities, and the crisis period salary reduction, totaled $3.1 million in present value. When the judge reviewed all evidence during the final hearing, his questions focused heavily on the salary reduction period and my increased responsibilities during the crisis. It was clear he was troubled by Richard's treatment of someone who had sacrificed so much for the company. The final hearing lasted 3 days and became increasingly uncomfortable for Richard and his legal team. Judge Harrison, a veteran of employment law cases, had clearly done his homework on the details of our case. On the first day, the judge questioned Richard extensively about the decision-making process behind my salary reduction. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Harrison asked, "when Miss Thompson voluntarily accepted a $120,000 annual reduction in compensation, did you discuss with her that this would be temporary?" Richard squirmed in his chair. "I believed it was understood that it was a temporary measure." "But there's no documentation of that understanding, is there? No written agreement specifying the duration of this reduction or the conditions under which her salary would be restored?" "No, Your Honor. It was a verbal agreement during a crisis situation." Judge Harrison made notes and continued. "And during this period of reduced compensation, did Miss Thompson's responsibilities increase or decrease?" Richard's lawyer had clearly coached him on this question, but his answer still came across as evasive. Her responsibilities evolved as the company's needs changed. That's not what I asked, Mr. Crawford. Did her responsibilities increase or decrease? They increased in some areas. According to the testimony we've heard, she took on business development, crisis, management, financial oversight, vendor relations, and employee communications. These are all executive-level responsibilities, correct? Some of those duties were temporary. For 18 months, the exchange continued for over an hour, with Judge Harrison methodically dismantling Richard's justifications for my treatment during the crisis. It became clear that the judge viewed Richard's actions as taking advantage of my loyalty and commitment during a vulnerable time for the company. On the second day, the focus shifted to the hidden contracts and my intellectual property. Judge Harrison questioned Richard about why he had deliberately excluded me from profitable engagements that used methodologies I had developed. Mr. Crawford, the Crawford method that forms the basis of these contracts. Who developed this methodology? It was developed collaboratively over time. That's not what the evidence shows. We have documentation, including emails and development notes, that show Ms. Thompson created this methodology independently and then proposed it as a company service. Are you disputing this evidence? Richard's lawyer objected, but Judge Harrison overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Crawford. Ms. Thompson was instrumental in developing the methodology, and yet she wasn't involved in implementing this methodology for clients like Brennan Industries, Hamilton Group, and Morrison Industries. Why? I felt I could handle those engagements personally, without consulting the person who created the methodology you were implementing. The questioning continued in this vein for hours. Judge Harrison was clearly building a record of Richard's systematic exclusion of me from work that was rightfully mine, both contractually and intellectually. On the third day, Judge Harrison heard closing arguments from both sides. David's presentation was masterful, walking through 15 years of my contributions to the company, the sacrifices I had made during the crisis, and the systematic way Richard had excluded me from the company's recovery while benefiting from my innovations. Richard's lawyer tried to argue that I was simply an employee who had been fairly compensated for my work, and that any additional compensation would be inappropriate. But this argument fell flat, given the overwhelming evidence of my actual contributions versus my official compensation. Judge Harrison's questions during the closing arguments made his thinking clear. He was particularly interested in the precedent this case might set for other employees who sacrifice for their companies during crises. Counselor, he asked Richard's lawyer, if we allow employers to take advantage of employee loyalty during difficult times and then discard those employees when times improve, what message does that send about the employment relationship? The lawyer's response was weak and unconvincing. When David presented his damages calculation, Judge Harrison asked detailed questions about each component. He was particularly interested in the intellectual property valuation and the punitive damages calculation. The Crawford method generates ongoing revenue for the company? Judge Harrison asked. Yes, Your Honor. It's become their signature service and generates approximately 60% of their current revenue. And Ms. Thompson created this methodology? Yes, Your Honor. She developed it independently and then allowed the company to use it as their primary service offering, without any compensation for the intellectual property rights? Correct, Your Honor. The judge's final ruling exceeded even David's most optimistic projections. Total compensation, $3.4 million and plus attorney fees and punitive damages, bringing the total to $4.1 million. Richard's face went ashen when the ruling was read. His company's annual revenue was approximately $2.8 million. Even liquidating all assets, Crawford and Associates couldn't generate enough cash to pay the judgment. The courtroom was silent as Judge Harrison read his decision. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his lawyers exchanging worried glances. I maintained my composure, but internally I felt a mixture of vindication and anticipation. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, Judge Harrison began. This court finds that Ms. Thompson was systematically undercompensated for her contributions to Crawford and Associates, particularly during the crisis period when she accepted a substantial salary reduction while simultaneously taking on increased responsibilities. He continued, "The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Crawford took advantage of Ms. Thompson's loyalty and commitment during a vulnerable time for the company, then excluded her from the benefits of the company's recovery while utilizing her intellectual property for personal profit." The judge's voice grew stern as he addressed the punitive damages. This court is particularly troubled by the premeditated nature of Ms. Thompson's termination and the systematic steps taken by Mr. Crawford to hide profitable work from someone who had sacrificed significantly for the company's survival. When Judge Harrison announced the total award of $4.1 million, I heard Richard's sharp intake of breath. His lawyer immediately leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. After the hearing ended and the courtroom cleared, David and I sat in a nearby conference room to discuss the implications of the ruling. Richard's legal team had requested an immediate meeting to discuss resolution options, which was legal speak for trying to avoid paying the full judgment. "Rebecca," David said, "they're going to come to us with a settlement offer, probably much lower than the judgment, but I think we have them in a position where we can be creative about how this gets resolved." That's when the idea first occurred to me. "David, what if instead of demanding cash payment, we offered to convert the judgment into equity ownership?" David raised his eyebrows. "That's actually brilliant. The company can't pay $4.1 million in cash, but it could potentially absorb that amount as a valuation adjustment if you became an owner." We spent the next hour working through the mathematics. Crawford and Associates had been valued at approximately $5.2 million for the purposes of calculating my intellectual property contribution. A $4.1 million judgment would represent roughly 79% ownership if converted to equity. But I suggested a slightly different approach. What if I proposed taking 75% ownership and forgiving $300,000 of the judgment? It gives Richard a face-saving 25% stake and ensures the company remains viable, which protects the value of my ownership interest. David smiled. "You're thinking like a businesswoman, not just a plaintiff. I like it." An hour later, Richard's lawyer called to request a settlement meeting. We agreed to meet the following day. The meeting was held in a neutral conference room at David's law firm. Richard looked haggard and defeated. His lawyer, a senior partner named William Stokes, seemed nervous and kept shuffling through documents. "Miss Thompson," Stokes began, "we're prepared to offer a substantial settlement to resolve this matter without the need for appeals or collection proceedings." "What did you have in mind?" David asked. "We can offer $800,000, payable over 3 years. David and I exchanged glances. It was less than 20% of the judgment. "That's insulting," David replied calmly. "The judgment is $4.1 million. Your client needs to get serious about resolution." Stokes looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Crawford's company simply doesn't have the liquid assets to pay the full judgment. We're talking about a small business, not a major corporation." That's when I spoke up. "Actually, I have a different proposal." I laid out my equity, conversion offer, 75% ownership of Crawford and Associates in exchange for forgiving $300,000 of the judgment. Richard would retain 25% ownership and could continue as president, but all major decisions would require my approval as majority owner. The room went silent. Richard stared at me as if I had suggested something impossible. "You want to own my company?" he asked quietly. "I want to own the company I helped build," I corrected. "The company that used my innovations, my client relationships, and my sacrifices to become successful. The company that I saved during its crisis and that excluded me from its recovery." Stokes immediately objected. "That's not a settlement. That's a hostile takeover." "No," David interjected. "It's a business solution that allows Mr. Crawford to retain significant ownership while satisfying the judgment. The alternative is liquidation to pay the cash judgment, which would leave Mr. Crawford with nothing." Richard sat quietly for several minutes, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally he asked, "If I accept this arrangement, What would my role be? You would continue as president, I replied. You'd handle day-to-day operations and client relationships, particularly with your personal network. But strategic decisions, major expenditures and policy changes would require my approval. And my salary would remain at current levels, assuming the company performs well. Richard looked at his lawyer, who was frantically making notes and calculations. After a whispered consultation, Stokes asked for a recess to discuss the proposal privately. In the end, he had no choice. When they returned an hour later, Richard looked like a man who had aged several years in 60 minutes. Stokes spoke for him. Mr. Crawford accepts the equity conversion proposal with some modifications to the operational details. The negotiations over those operational details took another 3 hours. Richard wanted protection against being fired without cause, guaranteed involvement in client relationships he had personally developed, and approval rights over any major changes to company culture or personnel policies. I agreed to most of his requests. I had no interest in being vindictive or in destroying what we had built together. I wanted justice and control, not revenge for its own sake. The final agreement was comprehensive and legally binding. I would receive 75% ownership of Crawford and Associates, with Richard retaining 25%. He would continue as president with a guaranteed 3-year employment contract. Major decisions, defined as expenditures over $50,000, new hires above manager level, changes to our service offerings, or modifications to our core business strategy, would require my approval. Richard would retain primary responsibility for the clients he had developed personally, while I would oversee operations, the Crawford method implementations, and strategic planning. We would split business development responsibilities with clear territories defined to avoid conflicts. Most importantly, the agreement included detailed intellectual property protections. The Crawford method was formally recognized as my creation, with appropriate documentation and legal protections. Any future variations or enhancements would be jointly owned, but the core methodology remained mine. The transition took 3 months to finalize. During this period, Richard E. and I worked together to inform employees, clients, and vendors about the ownership change. We crafted a narrative that emphasized continuity and stability while acknowledging that the company was evolving to better reflect the contributions of all key stakeholders. Most clients took the news well. Several mentioned that they had always assumed I was already an owner given my involvement in their projects. A few asked pointed questions about why the ownership change was happening, but we managed to handle these conversations without revealing the legal battle behind the transition. The employees were generally supportive. Many had witnessed my sacrifices during the crisis and felt the ownership change was long overdue. A few were concerned about potential changes to company culture or policies, but I assured them that our core values and operational approaches would remain consistent. The most challenging aspect of the transition was renegotiating our physical workspace. Richard D. had always occupied the largest office, which made sense when he was the sole owner. But as majority owner, I needed a workspace that reflected my new role, while allowing Richard to maintain dignity in his position as president. We ultimately decided to renovate the space, creating 2 equal-sized executive offices separated by a shared conference room. This arrangement symbolized our new partnership while giving us both the privacy and space we needed to work effectively. 3 months later, I walked back into the Crawford and Associates building, not as an employee, but as the majority owner. Richard remained as a minority partner and president, but all major decisions now required my approval. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman he had callously discarded as no longer needed was now his boss. I made few immediate changes. The employees who had remained loyal during the transition were rewarded with bonuses and improved benefits. The systems I had developed were formally recognized as company intellectual property, with proper documentation and protection. The first major test of our new working relationship came within a month of the transition. Meridian Manufacturing, our largest client, was considering expanding their engagement with us to include a second facility. The project would be worth approximately $500,000 over 18 months and would require significant resource allocation. Under our agreement, this qualified as a major decision requiring my approval. Richard presented the opportunity during our weekly strategy meeting, clearly testing whether I would support his client development efforts or use my authority to undermine him. I listened to his presentation, asked detailed questions about resource requirements and timeline, and ultimately approved the engagement. Richard seemed surprised by my straightforward approach. "You're going to let me handle this project?" he asked. "It's your client relationship," I replied. "You developed it. You understand their needs, and you're qualified to deliver the work. My role is to ensure we have the resources and support you need to succeed." This interaction established the tone for our new working relationship. I wasn't interested in micromanaging Richard or punishing him for past behavior. I wanted the company to succeed, which meant leveraging everyone's strengths effectively. Richard adapted to the new reality with surprising grace. Perhaps he realized that fighting the inevitable would only make things worse. Or perhaps he finally understood the magnitude of what he had thrown away. Whatever his motivation, he began approaching our partnership with genuine professionalism. Our first major decision as new partners involved the company's strategic direction. I proposed expanding our consulting services to include crisis management and organizational restructuring, areas where my recent experience had given me unique expertise. "After all," I told Richard during our first official board meeting, "I've learned quite a bit about navigating difficult transitions." He nodded, the irony not lost on him either. The expansion proved successful beyond our projections. Word had spread through industry networks about Crawford & Associates' own organizational transition, and several companies approached us specifically for crisis management consulting. These clients were dealing with their own leadership challenges, financial difficulties, or operational restructuring needs. I personally led these engagements, drawing on both my traditional consulting expertise and my recent experience navigating complex organizational change. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't anticipated, helping other companies avoid the pitfalls and deceptions I had experienced. 6 months into my ownership, Crawford & Associates reported its most profitable quarter in company history. Our reputation for innovative solutions and ethical business practices attracted new clients who specifically sought us out because of our story. One particularly significant engagement came from Davidson Electronics, a technology company that was struggling with succession planning. The founder was ready to retire, but his chosen successor was facing resistance from other family members and key employees. The situation was remarkably similar to what we had navigated with Meridian Manufacturing years earlier, but this time I was leading the engagement as the company owner rather than as Richard's subordinate. The difference in how clients related to me was striking. They viewed me as a senior decision maker and strategic advisor, not just as an implementation specialist. The Davidson project became another signature success story. We helped them develop a comprehensive succession plan that addressed both family dynamics and business continuity. The project generated 3 years $80,000 in revenue and led to referrals for 3 additional engagements. I never spoke publicly about the legal battle or Richard's betrayal. When clients or industry colleagues asked about the ownership change, I simply said that the company had evolved to better reflect the contributions of all its key stakeholders. But privately, I savored every small victory, every client who complimented our operational efficiency, systems I had developed, every employee who mentioned our improved workplace culture, policies I had implemented, every strategic decision that drove growth, initiatives I now led as majority owner. The Crawford method, now formally recognized as my intellectual property, became even more successful under my direct leadership. I was able to refine and enhance the methodology based on my expanded experience, and clients specifically requested my personal involvement in their projects. We developed advanced versions of the methodology for different industry sectors and company sizes. The Crawford method for healthcare. Organizations became particularly popular. generating substantial revenue from hospital systems and medical practices dealing with operational challenges. Richard continued to contribute valuable work, particularly with his personal network of clients. His relationships in the manufacturing and financial services sectors brought in steady business, and he handled these engagements competently. But it was clear that the intellectual and strategic leadership of the company had shifted to me. The woman who had once accepted a $120,000 salary cut to save someone else's company now controlled assets worth over $5 million. The executive who had been told she was no longer needed was now the primary decision-maker for the organization she had helped build. Richard still worked in the office next to mine. Sometimes I would see him through the glass partition, reviewing reports or taking calls with clients. He remained competent in his reduced role, and I bore him no personal animosity. Business was business, but I never forgot the lesson his betrayal had taught me. Loyalty should be a mutual contract, not a one-sided sacrifice. Trust must be earned continually, not assumed permanently. And sometimes, the best response to cruelty isn't anger or bitterness. It's the patient construction of a better outcome. Every morning when I entered my office, the same office where Richard had coldly informed me I was no longer needed, I remembered my simple response. "All right, good luck." It turned out he was the one who needed the luck. I had made my own. The Crawford & Associates logo now included a small tagline that I had added, "Excellence through partnership." Most people assumed it referred to our collaborative approach with clients. Only Richard and I knew it referred to the partnership he had tried to deny, and that I had ultimately claimed through persistence, documentation, and the patient pursuit of justice. A year after becoming majority owner, I was invited to speak at the National Association of Management Consultants annual conference. My presentation was titled, "Building Sustainable Partnerships in Crisis Situations," and while it focused on client relationships, the deeper message was about the importance of integrity in all business relationships. During the Q&A session, a young consultant asked about advice for dealing with workplace betrayal. I considered the question carefully before responding. "When someone shows you who they really are, believe them," I said. "But more importantly, show them who you really are. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply to outlast those who doubted you." The audience appreciated the advice, but I knew Richard, who was sitting in the third row, understood the full meaning behind my words. After my presentation, several attendees approached me with questions about our services. 3 of these conversations led to new client engagements worth over $200,000 combined. Richard congratulated me on the successful presentation and the new business it generated. "You've really found your voice as a leader," he said. And for the first time since our legal battle, his comments seemed genuinely supportive rather than grudging. Sometimes the best revenge isn't swift or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply outlasting those who underestimate you, building a case so methodically thorough that victory becomes inevitable, and transforming betrayal into opportunity. As I often told young professionals who sought my mentorship, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them, but more importantly, show them who you really are. I had shown Richard and myself exactly who I was. The woman who could be discarded was also the woman who could not be defeated, and that made all the difference.